Hello, and welcome to the Deep 404. It seems as though Israel is looking for war with Iran. We're having increased escalation in the Middle East, and some of the speculation as to what is driving this is that perhaps Iran is reaching a point of nuclear capability. Perhaps Israel is becoming fearful of the fact that Iran may have progressed over the last few years and may now be reaching a position where they are capable of developing nuclear capability. Israel certainly seems to be holding some sway over the United States. We have seen Joe Biden announcing the United States' complete commitment and support to Israel. This is apparent not only in the speeches he has given, but in the UN Security Council resolutions that have been proposed by the US and those that have been vetoed by the US. This strong support for Israel, there are many reasons for this, of course. Israel provides the US with a foothold in the Middle East, with a friendly nation there, and allows the US to project power into that area. We are seeing examples of that power projection also with already two US aircraft carrier groups in the area. And reports of possibly another two being moved to the Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, Red Sea area. There are reports of up to 900 American troops heading towards the Middle East, not to Israel, but to the Middle East, in support of the THAAD and PATRIOT air defense systems. There will be crews operating those air defense systems. So all of this support happening for Israel by the US, there's some reason for this happening. There's some reason for this recent escalation. The fact that we're reaching a point which we haven't reached in the past, a level of intense threat or danger of a global conflict starting up in the Middle East over the recent Hamas and Israeli conflict. There are some interesting theories floating around, tying a couple of the big stories of the past few years together. One of those stories being that Jeffrey Epstein, sex offender who was trafficking young girls on his island, that he may in fact have been a Mossad agent working for the Israeli Mossad intelligence service, the equivalent of the American CIA services. There has been talk that this may have actually been a organised operation by Mossad to produce someone like Jeffrey Epstein with the intent of them running a blackmail operation to obtain sway via blackmail over powerful American people. The flight logs indicating at least some of the people who travelled on Epstein's plane to his island obviously include people like former President Bill Clinton. So if you are looking to gain political blackmail power over people, something like that starts to perhaps make sense as a theory. And this combined with many other factors may be leading to why we are seeing this case of US supporting Israel so strongly in this conflict. At the recent UN Security Council, the US proposed a resolution that would see some humanitarian aid provided. However, it did not include a ceasefire. The wording of it was ultimately changed to include a pause. Now, a pause doesn't provide what a ceasefire would do. Pause is a sort of unclearly defined term, and that was vetoed by others. The Russians. The Russians proposed their own resolution, which did call for a ceasefire, and that was then vetoed by the US. The Brazilians also proposed a resolution involving a ceasefire, and the US also vetoed that one. So we can see that the Israelis, who are not looking for a ceasefire, who are continuing their bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip, who are now advancing and clashing in the West Bank area, do not appear to be looking for a ceasefire. They appear to be looking for war, and people are suggesting that they are using whatever leverage they can to draw the US into the conflict deeper and deeper, and ultimately get Iran involved and then engage the US in a conflict with Iran, and effectively have the US take out Israel's major concern in the Middle East, which is Iran. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has made a statement today on what appears to be, at least in the short term, the first of the US's involvement directly in this Middle East conflict, with the US striking in Syria, bases in Syria, which the United States are claiming are facilities controlled by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. These have been, Lloyd Austin announced that these strikes were carried out at President Biden's direction, and that they were considered self-defense strikes. These have been carried out as a result of the attacks recently on US bases in these areas. There have been ongoing activities in and around Israel in the last day or so. These strikes in Syria, in recent days, we had missiles fired by the Houthis from Yemen up along the Red Sea towards Israel. The conflict itself is seeing continued airstrikes in Gaza. The citizens of Gaza are suffering under a lack of food and fuel and medical care and electricity. Effectively, the healthcare sector in Gaza has now become non-existent because of these reasons. Video from yesterday showed what was reportedly an unannounced strike on a residential area in Gaza. This was a massive strike where a whole compound of residential buildings were destroyed by either highly explosive bombs or missile strikes. Reportedly, no announcement prior to this attack was given. Attacks of this scale and size, I don't believe, can be considered to be targeted attacks when they are upon residential buildings. Hamas has continued to carry out rocket attacks into central Israel, causing limited damage to infrastructure. Just so you are aware, the power of the Israeli bombs and missile are orders of magnitude larger than the power of the Hamas rockets that are being fired. Now, the Hamas rockets can, of course, cause damage, kill and maim people, but they are not able to do so on anywhere near the scale or size that the Israeli missile and bombs are capable of doing. Interestingly, in the last 24 hours, it seems as though activity from Hezbollah in Lebanon on the northern border of Israel has paused or slowed down or stopped. I don't know what the reason for this is. It is unusual given that Hezbollah have been active over the last couple of weeks in this conflict with skirmishes on the border. Hezbollah haven't launched a full attack into Israel, but they have been engaging in skirmishes. For them to go quiet for a day is an interesting turn of events, and one to watch over the next few days, over the weekend, to see if they resume activity or what may be happening there. Reportedly, even though there weren't activities in the last 24 hours from Hezbollah, the Israeli Defense Forces continued shelling southern Lebanon during the day. There have been protests on the Iraqi-Jordanian border, and that has prevented fuel from reaching Israel through Jordan. There has been an announcement, a joint announcement from 9 Arab nations decrying what is happening in Gaza and calling for ceasefire. We've had the attacks of the American bases in Syria. And we are seeing here from Israel continued reports that the ground operation in Gaza will begin soon when these conditions are right. Now, what these conditions will be or need to be considered right, it seems, is the readiness of the United States. What the Israelis appear to be doing here by delaying their ground forces is providing time for the US to position themselves, their troops, their air defense systems, their aircraft carriers in the area. Now, the Americans are claiming that the aircraft carriers are not there for active operations, that they are there simply as a deterrent, and that their presence would be there to deter Hamas or Hezbollah or Syria or Iran getting involved in this conflict. However, it is a very large force to have in the area, purely to dissuade the Arab nations from becoming involved. It feels as though the American forces are preparing for conflict, with troops being readied, with strike capabilities of multiple aircraft carriers being deployed to the region, with the most advanced American air defense systems being deployed. This feels more than just a deterrent operation being mounted by the US, and we will find out, I would imagine, very shortly what the real intention of the US forces here are. As we've seen, there have already been active strikes into Syria. This is not into Gaza against Hamas. This has been into Syria, and it has been targeted, what the US have said, are Iranian-backed groups in Syria. So this is all leading towards conflict between the US and Iran, with Israel seemingly able to coax the US to come to their protection and bring the might of the American military to the Middle East to confront Iran. Now, as I've mentioned before, this conflict in the region that it is around the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, this is just south of the Black Sea area and the Caspian Sea, which is where in the Black Sea, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has recently announced that there will now be full-time 24/7 MiG-31 patrols over the Black Sea. the northern area of the Caspian Sea, which the Russians use for launching missile strikes from some of their large bombers. This puts the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, where the US aircraft carriers are likely to be, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, within range of Russian Kizhal missiles. Now, in the last week, Moscow has hosted a delegation of Hamas representatives there to talk with Russia about how they can address the situation that's going on, how they can look to address humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. The Iranians have spoken with the Russians, and there is a growing bond there between Russia and Iran. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, travelled to Tehran, and while what has been discussed hasn't been relayed, one would think, given Sergei Lavrov's general nature, that he has probably travelled there just to reassure Iran or coach Iran into keeping a cool head for the present time and not being drawn into a conflict with Israel or with the US. From what I have seen and read of late, it does not appear as though Iran is looking to get into a conflict with the US and Israel. However, it does seem as though Israel is looking for war with Hamas, and Israel and the US seem keen to reach beyond the boundaries of Palestine, of where the Hamas fighters are, into the West Bank, into Lebanon, into Syria, offensively. So interesting to see how far the Russians may get drawn into this if this does erupt into a conflict between Iran, the US, and Israel. There was also a missile that struck in Egypt today, in Taba, near the Gulf of Aqaba. This injured 5 people and caused damage to a residence. Now, while again it hasn't been clarified whose missile this was, the Israeli army response was that we are aware of a security incident in the Taba area near the Israeli border in Egypt, but the incident occurred outside our borders. Now, Taba is about 200 kilometers south of Gaza, and while I haven't researched this in detail, I am not certain or overly confident that the Hamas rockets would have that range, that 200 kilometer range. Now, I may be wrong, and they may have received some that do, but on the face of it, I get the impression that this is more likely an Israeli missile that has traveled this distance. Now, again, this one isolated incident may well have been a malfunctioning of a missile, and it has just gone off course and landed there. I haven't yet seen a response from Egypt about this, but it will be interesting to see just if this does mean something or if it has simply been a misfired missile effectively. At the United Nations, just again for some sense of what is being said about this, Dmitry Polyansky, who was the first deputy, a permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, said after the vetoing of the Russian and Brazilian resolutions, I'll quote him, "Just to make things clear, the UN Security Council had a choice today between US drafts giving a license to Israel to kill more Palestinian civilians and conduct ground operations in Gaza, and a Russian one calling for immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Both drafts condemned what Hamas did on October the 7th, but the US one ignored Israel's violations of international humanitarian law against civilians in Gaza. So don't be misled when US and its allies will shed crocodile tears about children getting killed in Gaza. They have just shown that they simply don't give a damn." Now, earlier this week, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres suggested that the Hamas attacks were not entirely unprovoked. He said that it is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. He said this at a UN Security Council meeting. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, has said that UN officials will have visa applications for Israel refused. And this is because of these comments by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Israeli ambassador Erdan said that the time has come to teach them a lesson, referring here to the UN officials. He's even called for Antonio Guterres the resignation, that he should leave his role, for suggesting that the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum and may not have been entirely unprovoked. So we can see that within the West, the US, strong support, the UK, Australia, the Western nations aligning still, and strong support for Israel in this conflict. However, large swathes of the rest of the world are not aligning behind Israel, and Israel runs the risk here of seeing sentiment for Israel shift. We have already seen many large-scale rallies around the world, in Western nations, interestingly, in Sydney, throughout America, in European nations, in coming out large-scale demonstrations in support of Palestinians and the civilians in Palestine. This, in many cases, has been unexpected. And if you look at Twitter and you follow some of the higher profile personalities there, particularly some of the high profile Jewish personalities there, this has been something which has really drawn their anger and attention and appears to be somewhat unexpected, which indicates to me that in the West there is an opportunity for Israel to make a large misstep here and find themselves being seen as the bully by a growing percentage of the population, including Western population. Now, just like we've seen with Ukraine, if what's happening isn't successful, becomes politically problematic, US support for these sort of things will begin to taper off, as we're already seeing, and I'll come to in a moment and speak a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine in the last few days. But yes, for Israel, there is that risk. Now, they would have to go a lot further before the US would stop backing Israel. And as I've mentioned, there is growing speculation that Israel may have some very powerful dirt on some very senior American people. And if that is the case, that will aid Israel in retaining its support from the US. Anyhow, moving on a little to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is facing a slew of problems at the moment. The US has just announced a new Speaker of the House, who is Republican Mike Johnson. He is a Trump supporter and was involved in Trump's campaign to have it confirmed that elements of the 2020 election were corrupt and that votes had been rigged or mishandled. He was supportive. Mike Johnson was supportive of Trump in that. In his inauguration speech, he failed to mention Ukraine, instead declaring that the priority for the US is Israel. Today, he has made an announcement. And again, this is not what the Biden administration was hoping for and not what Ukrainian President Zelensky was hoping for. Mike Johnson has said that any new military aid packages for Ukraine and Israel will be considered separately by the House of Representatives. So what this means is that the Biden administration's attempt to bundle the $14 billion for Israel into a package with $60 billion for Ukraine. The idea here being that right now, no one in America will say no to Israel. And if that's tied to funding for Ukraine, then Ukraine would get its funding too. What Mike Johnson is now saying is that that won't fly and that won't be going ahead. Each of those two funding requests will be reviewed and voted upon independently. Some of his comments around this which is due to the growing Republican skepticism over this continual funneling of vast amounts of US taxpayer dollars to other nations, while the country itself suffers from its own domestic problems. Mike Johnson has announced that they need greater accountability. And just quoting him, he says, "We want accountability and we want objectives that are clear from the White House." So the main source of funding for Ukraine, the $60 billion, which is half of the $122 billion that was signed off on in 2022, the $60 billion that is being looked at now to get through until September of 2024, reportedly, is now going to come under closer scrutiny and won't just slide through with the Israeli funding. On top of this, the EU is failing to fulfill its own promise of supplying Ukraine with ammunition. They had promised to provide to Kiev by March of 2024 1 million artillery shells, and now near the end of October, nearly in November, so only 5 months away, they have achieved only 30% of that volume. There's also comments from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about the cost of ammunition, and that's putting pressure on the NATO nations. So this, combined with the fact that we know that the NATO nations are struggling to produce ammunition, and now the US is pivoting to Israel, who already with Hamas is asking for artillery shells. If this extends into a conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria or Jordan or with Iran, then you can imagine that the ability of the EU to provide any shells to Ukraine will be severely reduced. Hungary has announced its reaction in the European Union to the recent meeting between Vladimir Putin and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. They have said there that Hungary, I'll just sort of quote a little bit here. The foreign minister, this is Sijato, I made it clear that Hungary is a sovereign state. Hungary implements a sovereign foreign policy based on national interests, and we do not receive, do not accept, and will not even consider anyone's instructions or advice from outside. So, Hungary in the EU, we are seeing the pressures, the strains that Ukraine is putting on institutions like the EU and NATO. Hungary's further suggested that the EU needs to first develop a new strategy in the conflict in Ukraine and then allocate money to Kiev, not just give money now without an understanding or accountability of where it's going and what it's being used on. Also, Robert Fico, the new Prime Minister of Slovakia, along with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, have spoken out against the allocation of a €50 billion euro aid package to Ukraine. According to Fico, part of the money that has previously been allocated to Kiev went for other purposes into corruption channels, and there are no guarantees to the EU that this will not happen again. Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia has also said that it will refuse to supply arms to Ukraine, and that the European Union must transform itself from the arms supplier it is now into a peacemaker. He went on to say it's better that they, Russia and Ukraine, negotiate peace for 10 years than kill each other for 10 years without any conclusions. And he's basically said that he would... he's in favour of ending hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, and at this stage did not care what kind of peace plan that would end in. So, see European nations now wearing thin on the funding of the war against Russia. Many of them now, I would imagine, starting to recognise that the US has, in effect, played them to no benefit. They've contributed millions, billions of dollars, euros, equipment, time, effort, suffered under increased energy prices, deindustrialization of their nations, to aid the US in their attempts to weaken Russia. This has backfired on them all dramatically, and now they can see the US basically giving up on Ukraine and pivoting and focusing on the Israel conflict. Hungary. So Hungary and Slovakia. Hungary has also, if you recall, Sweden has been granted the option to enter NATO. Now, in order for Sweden to get into NATO, there were two other nations that needed to ratify this. This was Turkey and Sweden. And at the time that it was announced, Turkey and Hungary. And at the time that it was announced that Sweden was going to be admitted to NATO, it was understood that if Turkey said that they would agree to do that and allow Sweden in, that Hungary would follow suit. Now, interestingly, the Hungarian parliament has again not included a vote on the ratification of Sweden's membership in NATO in the agenda. This has been announced by Agnes Vadai, a lawmaker from the opposition Democratic Coalition Party. So we see Hungary, again, NATO member, stalling on allowing Sweden in. Now, Turkey has reasons, Hungary has reasons for why they personally may not want Sweden in NATO, but overall there is a bigger picture here of disunity among the member nations of NATO if two of them are holding out on admitting Sweden. So while many people have said that Russia's concerns about NATO advancement moving eastwards, and that being the reason for them getting into the conflict with Ukraine, has backfired on Russia because now Sweden will be joining. Well, it doesn't seem as though Sweden is joining yet. Hungary and Turkey have had opportunity to ratify this. They could have called special meetings and ratified it immediately had they wanted to, but they are pushing it off. They're kicking it down the road. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has proposed forming an independent regional payment and settlement mechanism for the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and ensuring currency conversion on national exchanges using native currencies. So he has stated this at a meeting of the Council of Heads of Government of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This, again, we see in non-Western nations this drive to de-dollarize and take power out of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, with further initiatives to allow for payment and settlement through a system other than the SWIFT banking system, and one that will allow for settlement in the currencies of the nations involved. We're already seeing examples of this with things like India buying oil from Russia in rupees rather than dollars, Argentina paying off debt to the IMF in Chinese RMB rather than dollars. This is a growing trend in the BRICS nations, who are looking to introduce their own centralized BRICS currency. Now, this will be different to the euro, which the EU uses. Now, the euro is a currency which is used by the nations, but also by the population. The general civilian living in a country in the EU can use the euro and buy and pay for things with that. The BRICS currency is purported to not be like that. It will not become one for the general public to use. It will be a currency used for international transactions, allowing those BRICS nations to trade amongst themselves without having to rely on the dollar. Now, by doing that, what that now means is the US's ability to sanction those nations over the use of the US dollar is weakened. Those nations now have an option. If they want to buy something from a country and that country has been told you cannot trade in US dollars, they can say that's fine. We can now buy other products, oil and whatever it might be, oil, grain, whatever we might need, and we can pay for it in our own currency. So another example of that now being promoted with non-Western non-Western nations. Now, moving just a little to about some of what's been going on the front line and the battling in Ukraine. Now, while America is turning away from Ukraine and has got more interesting things to do in the Middle East at the moment, the Russians are not slowing down. In the last 24 to 48 hours, there have been continued advances for the Russians all along the front. There have been, in the Kherson region, the Ukrainian attempts to get across the river and onto the islands and to then strike on settlements like Krniki over the Dnieper River, which is around the Pishanovka and Poima areas, which are just up to the north and east and southeast of Kazachi Lahiri, that area. while there have been troop movements by the Ukrainians into those areas, they have been pushed back out again. There has been use of Fab 500 bombs by the Russians in this area for some time, and there is talk now of evacuation of Ukrainian civilians from Kherson and surrounding areas on the west side of the Dnieper River there. So this perhaps a telltale sign that the Ukrainians pardon me perhaps a telltale sign that the Ukrainians are anticipating a Russian advance over the Dnieper, or at least an intensification of the Russian shelling and bombing activity of the Kherson area across the Dnieper River, perhaps in preparation for a Russian advance at some stage in the future. Even south of Kherson, in the Mykolaiv area, reports of another ammunition dump being struck. The strikes continue in this area and have been ongoing here for a number of months now, really since the Black Sea Grain Initiative concluded. Through Odessa up into Mykolaiv and the ports up in there. This area is seen as a staging area for the activities in the Kherson region. Troops, equipment being amassed there and then moving northwards from Mykolaiv up towards Kherson. And the Zaporozhye region, there has been a lull, a pause due to weather conditions, but this has in the last 24 hours resumed. The fighting has resumed there again. Now the Russians, again, using the TOS flamethrower systems and drones. As we've seen in this conflict, the drones have been the real game changer here, and they are being used to great effect. There has been a series of videos come out over the last 24 hours, which are now indicating that the Lancet, the Russian Lancet drone, which is a loitering munition, now has enhanced target locking capabilities. Previously, I've not seen this, but now we're seeing all of these videos from the Lancets as they're on approach with a target locking ability. So there's been some upgrade in their visual detection systems, giving them the ability to now, be more consistently capable of striking a target, not going to lose it for some reason by now being able to target lock onto that. Some of the targets shown in these videos over the last few days have included Leopard tanks in the Zaporozhye region around Robotyne or Robotne and Verbova. There has been use of the flamethrowers of these Lancets and other FPV drones, as well as reportedly Fab 500 aerial bombs being dropped on this area, and no progress for the Ukrainians, their attacks being repelled, and reportedly loss of German Leopard tanks in this area. Even north, the Krasny Liman area, Ukrainian telegram channels here, interestingly, not just Russian ones, are reporting significant advances of the Russian armed forces on the border of Luhansk People's Republic in the Kharkov region. The Makiivka area here, there have been Ukrainian confirmation that Russian advances yesterday in that area were successful, and that today they are continuing, and that there are numbers of Ukrainian strongholds being taken in the last 24 hours. Now, that's happening. So we've got repelled attacks for the Ukrainians in the Kherson region, the Russians holding ground there. Mykolaiv area, the staging area, there are missile strikes there taking out ammunition dumps. In Getting up in the northern areas, Krasny Liman, telegram channels of the Ukrainians reporting Russian success in that area. And then in Rabotino, Zaporozhye region, loss of leopards in those areas and the Ukrainian attacks repelled. And then finally in the Donetsk area around Avdiivka. Avdiivka, the township which has been reinforced and strengthened and prepared and turned into a fortress over the last 8 years, is now falling to the Russians. Probably a little over a week or 10 days ago, the Russians began an approach from 3 fronts: from the north, from the south, and from the southwest. They pushed up from the south towards the bottom of Avdiivka itself, and then from the north and and from the southwest, they formed pincers around Avdiivka, cutting off supply routes into Avdiivka. Now, that has continued, and in the last 2 days, there is an industrial coke plant which has, just to the northeast of it, a slag heap, a waste dump of waste materials from that process. It's an elevated area, and the Russians have now solidified control over that. It was in a grey zone for a period of time, but as of today, it appears as though the Russians now have control over that and are able to use that elevated position to now gain supremacy, looking back down towards the south over the northern area of Avdiivka. So reports from both Russian telegram channels and Ukrainian telegram channels are now indicating the Russians having success there with continued pushes. There has been massive artillery and bombing and rocket strikes on Avdiivka for the last 2 weeks, with what is reportedly today being the encirclement and full fire control over the last main supply road into Avdiivka. There are reports of large numbers of reserves being drawn up. The 47th Brigade from Zaporozhye, where we've just heard of the attacks on the leopards, where they have suffered heavily there over the last 4 months. What's remaining of them appears to be being pulled up to Avdiivka to try to strengthen the line there. However, the main resupply routes are via the train lines. These are now under fire control of the Russians, so it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply into Avdiivka, which will make it an absolute nightmare for the Ukrainian troops who are left in Avdiivka and become trapped in there with Russians surrounding them on all sides. And just as a scale of what the Russian onslaught there has been, at the start of the big push of a week or fortnight ago, it was reported there were over 200 machines operating, 200 pieces of artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, self-propelled artillery, tanks firing upon the area. In one report that I read by a Russian in the area, they were talking about the continuing attacks of the Russian ground attack aircraft and the helicopters. And they were saying that they would just circle in one after another. So obviously pushing the Ukrainians underground into secure locations. They're not being impacted by ground to air, man pads, and this sort of air defence. Other air defence in the area has been overwhelmed. The report was that they were just cycling in one after another, and the bombardment and rocket strikes from the helicopters and jets was so continuous that it gave the impression of one giant machine gun striking Avdiivka. One of those things, the way it was written and that I saw it in my mind, it reminded me of some of the stories that you've heard from World War One, when the shelling was going on there, and it was just a cannonade, just a constant roar of activity. That's the impression I got of what's been going on at sometimes in Avdiivka. So just in terms again of the Russians' air capability, as I've mentioned, the Landsat drones now appear to have upgraded target locking capabilities. Yesterday, Rostec has delivered another batch of the new multi-role Su-35S fighter jets to the Russian aerospace forces. In terms of AWACS, the large reconnaissance planes with the large radar mushroom on their back. Now, this is an interesting note here. There have been talks that Russia lacks these, and that for them to cover all of Russia to the extent that they would like, that they would want about 100 of these. And this would be what would be required if they were engaging in war on all fronts of Russia. However, reportedly, what they currently have in the fleet is 16 A50s and one A20, and the A20 is an upgraded version of the A50. Will go into mass production next year. I did read that they are starting to produce more of those at the moment. This, interestingly, compared to reportedly NATO's fleet of AWACS aircraft, NATO has 13 of these, while Russia on its own has 16, and then A50 and one A10, so 17 in total. Now, the last week of activity, the Russians have reportedly destroyed 24 Ukrainian aircraft, and this is with the R-37M missile. So this is Russian fighter jets taking out Ukrainian aircraft. So overall, in summary, Israel is taking the US's attention, and that means it'll be taking the US's funding, and it's going to be harder for Ukraine to receive that funding. There are even Le Monde French outlets now reporting that they're predicting that Ukraine will run out of ammunition in 2024. Now, well before Ukraine runs out of ammunition, Ukraine is going to be struggling if it doesn't get continued US funding. Even if it comes late, it's just going to be a compounding problem. That funding is used to pay people to do jobs, to keep cities and the government running. Once that money starts to dry up, there will be a larger exodus from Ukraine. And if the military equipment also isn't there with the funding, then as Russia rolls into this coming winter with a growing number of volunteers swelling its military, while Ukraine is looking to scrape the bottom of the barrel to grab anyone that it can to fight. People of old age, people who are unwell mentally, physically, drawing women into combat in Ukraine. Ukraine will be pushed onto the defensive, and unfortunately, if Ukraine hasn't already prepared its defenses, then those defenses will be weak and insufficient to stop the grinding roll westwards towards the Dnieper that the Russians will undertake. And this will be a very, very tough winter for Ukraine. All right. Thank you very much. If you've watched this far, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.